Hello, this is Tomasino, and I am back at you with another Gemini video. This one's an exciting one. We're going to talk about how to build a sample CGI application, like the whole thing, right? So I wrote up kind of what we're going to talk about here on my journal over Untitled Team late last month on the 20th. What is it? No, 2022-02-21. So on the 21st. There you go. A couple caveats. I think the big one here is this is going to be written in Python. I am not a Python programmer. I know enough Python to code in Python. That is not the same thing. So the other big caveat here is this is all written stream of conscious. I was kind of like, I know what I want to do. Let me just write it all out. And so it's not well organized. It's not like in it's not like in an MVC or something. It's really just kind of there, right? Those points aside, I think this is going to be really informative if you've never built a app in Gemini before. If you're just getting started, you're looking like, where do I start? What do I do? We'll talk about the whole thing, okay? So I'm going to demo it first for you here in Crystal and show you what we're going to look at code-wise. All of the source code is on the tilde-git repo, tildeget.org/Tomasino, and it's actually in the repo for my whole Gemini capsule. But I will have a link for it in the notes of this video. And, you know, if you know how to find my capsule, there's this post as well that you can kind of find the links to as well. Now, prereqs. If you haven't done so already, I would recommend watching my video on Gemini input. It talks about how to use the response code 10 and response code 60 to get either basic input from the user or to request a TLS client certificate. Both of those things are going to be essential for what we're doing here. And that video talks about them in exhaustive detail. Really, you know, all of the things you could possibly want to know about them. Okay. So if you're already familiar with that stuff though, then you're in good hands. Here we go. Okay. A sample CGI application. This is what we're going to click on first. And this lives on tilde team, tilde Tomasino, and the folder is CGI example. All right. This overview here this was written as a README, and it kind of was my checklist for what I wanted the features to be. If you want to set this up yourself, the setup is quite simple. You just need the files, and then you need to create a SQLite database. Now, I have the schema for that in the repo, and we'll look at that and what it creates a little bit later. I'm creating it into this folder DB, and I'm creating it a SQLite database called Cgi example.sqlite3. Now, the reason I did it in a folder and not just in the project root is because of the way SQLite works for making updates. It actually creates a second file next to your main database and then like updates the main file when it commits those changes. I probably said that wrong technically, but you get the idea. It creates a second file. There's ways around it. There's ways to configure SQLite to not do that. I don't know what those are. And I'm on a shared system anyway, so I'm not sure if I have the rights to do that anyway. So what that means, though, is because Gemini on this server is not running as me, it's running as, it's either nobody or it's running as a Gemini user. I can't remember which until the team, but it's not me, right? So I need to make sure that this is writable by the Gemini user. So in my case, I just chmada this thing like 777 and like enjoy. Now, obviously, that is not the way to do it. If you're on a shared system with other users, you're going to want to find some other way to secure this thing. But for our illustrative point, that's kind of it, right? The parent folder needs to be writable because we're creating that second file in there. So it's not just the file, but the whole folder. There are strategies around that are outside the scope of this video, but something to consider, okay? And, oh, and look, I even did a little write-up about that. Cool. That was really hard to debug when it started popping up, by the way. All right, so let's dive in. We're going to log in with our client certificate to begin. Now, I have used this test cert here already to log into this and create an account already. We're going to do that to start, but then I'm going to show you what it looks like coming in with a new identity. Okay, so I've logged in. Welcome, user logged in. Your user ID is 1. Awesome. Your username is Tomasino. Hey, that's me. Now we have 3 options. We can change the username. We can generate an auth code to add another cert to your account. We'll talk about that at length. And we could add another cert to your account with the auth code. Okay, cool. So the first part of that is pretty straightforward. Changing the username. I'm going to navigate to this change name page. If you see it down at the status bar at the bottom there. And that is going to prompt me for my name. Well, instead of being Tomasino, I'll be James. Your name has been changed. Back to the main menu, and boom, there it is. It worked. So that's really cool. Kind of boring, but this is a sample application, and what I'm really trying to show you here is we can set user-level data connected to our user ID. In a real application, this will be something much more meaningful. It'll be your to-do list. It'll be your astrobotany plant info, right? It'll be something beyond your name. But that's how it's associated. That's really cool. Now, what about this? Generate an auth code to add another cert to your account. All right, so that's going to take us to this update auth code page. And that page is going to give us this authorization code. I'm going to copy that to my clipboard here. You see, it says link to add cert page with auth code. And if you look down in the status bar at the bottom, it goes to the page add cert, and there's a query parameter getting passed through, and it happens to be, that's right, this auth code. So what is this for? What does this do? Well, it's a really essential part of building a robust Gemini application. If I create a new account based on a TLS certificate hash, and I only use that hash as the ID for users, then you're stuck either having that user limited to that one system, or you force users to have to share their TLS certs across devices in order to continue to log into the same account. Not a great experience. A lot of clients don't make it easy to export or import TLS keys, or TLS client certificates rather. So what we do instead is when we create a new user, we link the TLS hash with that user, but we allow you a mechanism to add additional certs to that user as well. So you can have multiple certs all connecting to the same account. Now, the mechanism I've coded here for that is this authorization code. It generates you a random string, and then you can use that. You can log in with a different cert, put in the auth code, and it says, this auth code belongs to user 1. So obviously, I'm going to take your new cert and associate it with user 1. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to take this auth code, we're going to copy it, and we're going to go back to the main page. And then I'm actually going to go back from here to the main CGI example. So I'm not logged in anymore. I'm going to turn off my client cert, and I'm going to log in again. Now this time, rather than using my test cert, I'm going to create a transient session certificate. We'll just do this one for 30 minutes. So this is a brand new cert, and you can see that because I'm now user ID 17. I'm not 1 anymore. So it created a brand new user, and there's no username set yet. So this is a totally unrelated thing, right? But if I go to this add another cert to your account, Gibby, and I put in the auth code, now this auth code is associated with user 1. So when I click OK, it associated the key with that account. And when I go back to the main page, boom, I'm on user 1. And this transient cert I just created is now associated with user 1. It's another way to log in. And instead of a transient cert, you can imagine, I took that code and I kicked it over to my phone, and I opened up Lagrange on my phone, and I created a new certificate, and I logged in and pasted the code there. So that's it. That's how you do it. If I wanted to add another cert, I could, clicking this add another cert thing will prompt me for this. If I were in the generate an auth code link, this link that had it already appended at the end, if I copy that link and paste it, then because the auth code is already included, it doesn't prompt me. It just says, hey, your new key's been added. Cool. So you can kind of take that that one link and kick that over to yourself via Signal or IRC or something, and boom, now you're associated. And that's kind of it. That's what I wanted to show off, right? So this is an application because it allows you to create multiple entry points from different client certs and manage those. It allows you to set and change data associated with that user. And that's kind of it. That's all you need for a robust Gemini app. And it's all done over CGI. And let's look at how, okay? So I'm going to go back to this CGI example root page here, and the project source can be found here on ~get in my gem space, but it's also open right over here. So where do we begin? Well, let's look at the Readme. This should look familiar because it is the exact same content we saw right here, and there's a reason for that. My index.gmi page is actually a Python script that I'm running that is opening the README and printing it. That much of the README that I have included here happens to also be valid gem text. So I kind of used it for both, and then I add some print lines to have links to the project source and getting started for the login. Now this getting started login is just going to take me to the login page. That's the description there. Let's go take a look at login and see what we do to begin. But before I do that, I did promise I was going to take a look at the SQL schema. So this is the database that we create to use all of this. This is a SQLite database that I've used here because it's really easy on a shared system. We have two tables. One is certs, one is users. The users table gets an ID that's totally unique integer. It has a name field. This is what we were setting when we changed our name. And it has this add key code field, which is text. Terrible name for it. I should have called it authorization code or something instead, but that's what that holds. Primary key is our ID, and it auto increments. Now, our certs table, this tracks the TLS hash. We make sure that they're unique and non-null. It also has the user ID as an integer. This is a foreign key that references our ID from our users table. And the primary key for this table is the hash itself. So we have a one-to-many relationship here. You can have many certs associated with a single user ID, which is exactly what we talked about. That's what we want, right? So let's look at how it works. When you log in for the first time, we are going to call this index.gmi, which is another Python script. Now, as I said, this is not well structured as an application. I have all of my page logic and my data logic all kind of meshed together here. I'm not structuring this thing for, object-oriented anything. I'm not structuring it for proper functional anything. This is just kind of, train of thought code. So, if you have built applications in the past, whether they're, web or console or whatever, I'm sure you'll have a better way to structure those yourself. Use what you know, but this should illustrate the points. Okay, so up at the top here, we can kind of ignore this stuff. I'm importing some dependencies, specifically a helpers file and a DB file, which I have here, helpers and DB, and we're going to reference them quite a bit because that's where I have most of the meat of the code. Beyond that, we do a lot of printing to the screen for each given page. This is just straight gem text down here where I'm filling in some variables. And then the actual application logic is this little block in between. So the first thing we're going to do is get the client cert. Now, if you've watched my Gemini input video, you know what this looks like. We We serve up a type 60 if we don't see a client cert already. If we do see a client cert, we grab the TLS hash from the environment variable. This function here, get client cert, does exactly that. It is a helper that says get the TLS client hash from the environment variable. Again, this might be a different name if you're using a different Gemini server. If that's not set, then we're going to show the header that says cert required, which is a response code 60. If it is found, we show the OK header, which is response code 20, and we return the TLS client hash. Boom, there it is, TLS client hash. Now, we're going to call this check hash function, which is part of my database code, passing the client hash, and we're going to get back a user ID. That's a little optimistic, right? What if that doesn't exist? What if it's a brand new client hash? Well, let's take a look. TLS client hash, we said we're going to check hash, right? All right, check hash gets past TLS client hash. We create a database connection. With that, we're going to get the user. We're going to call this get user function, which will pass at the client hash, and it's going to return a user ID. Well, get user is going to execute a very complex SQLite query that says select the user ID from certs where the hash equals whatever. All right. If it finds it, it finds it. If it doesn't, it returns a none. If the user ID is none, we call add user, and we pass that same connection, right? So we're going to create a brand new user ID, and then we're going to add a hash that references that user ID. Simple stuff. Here is a point in your code where you might want to diverge, though. Let's say that your application, when somebody shows up with a new cert, maybe you don't automatically create them a user account. Maybe you query and you say, hey, I haven't found your user account. Do you want to create a new account? Or is this a key that you want to associate with an existing account? And here's an opportunity where you could prompt them for, that add key variable. That would be a little smarter way to run it if you have that same kind of structure. But I mean, there could be a number of different options. Maybe you have a restricted system and you don't want to automatically create new users. Who knows? Whatever. This is where that logic is. In mine, I just automatically create a new user for every key if it's never been seen before. And we get back a user ID, whether new or existing. And then we're going to query the username from that user ID. So we call this get name, and get name is right here. Get name, simple SQL command here, get the name from users. If it's null, then we write not set, which is what you saw when we used our transient cert, that 30-minute cert. It showed not set because we hadn't set anything yet. And then it builds the page. And that's it. That's your login. So we did authorization, we did user creation, and we fetched data from that record all in one really quick. Simple, right? So let's look at the next thing you can do. How about changing that name? Similar thing, import some helpers, similar thing, output some text to the screen. What is our main logic? Again, we're going to fetch our TLS client hash because we need that on every one of these pages. We're going to then get the query string. Now, again, in my Gemini input video, we talked at length about this. To get a input from a user, you are going to check for a query environment variable, query parameter. Let's see, what is it called? Query string environment variable. If it's set, then you got it already. That's it. Input, done. If you don't see a query string, then we can serve a response code 10, which is this guy here. Now, instead of having your text Gemini car set info following your response code, a type 10, whatever is after that 10, is the message that gets served to the user in that little pop-up window. So that's your kind of input label. And so we have a little helper here. We can pass that through. Our input label says, what is your name? Now, if you are getting the query string, we check first for the the input, for the environment variable. If it's set, then we're done. If it's not set, then we do this this thing where we show the query string. So despite this saying get query string and having a string in here, we might not actually show this. That username might be fetched automatically. Okay. Regardless, this page load could happen in two different ways when it hits this line. Actually, it could happen in two different ways on this line. Either it's going to say, I need a client cert, or if it sees one, it's going to say, I got a client cert. Here, it's going to say, I need a query string, or it's going to say, I got a query string. So these two lines kind of have four different branches, if you will. Then we're going to use this username. Actually, first we're going to do this check hash on the TLS client hash to get the user ID, because we need that as well. And then we're going to call this set name, and we're going to associate the username with the user ID. So set name is right here, and it is a simple update that sets the name where ID equals the user ID. Very simple query, but you can see the logic. We needed both kind of queries for this interaction. We needed the TLS cert to do anything, and we wanted some user input to do something specific. Cool. Now, again, you could do this for much more complex info than just changing a name. This might be some very fundamental application logic for you. This could be water your plant, right? All right. Now, let's look at these last things here, the add cert and the update auth code. I mentioned these are important because you don't want to limit your app to a single TLS client cert. In general, you might actually be coding something that does want to do that, right? You might not ever want to allow a second cert in. If you're building one of those one-off private use apps like Solderpunk mentioned in his capsule, many moons ago, maybe this is a hard-coded thing. Awesome. But if it's not, and we do want to make it available across platforms and have these accounts associated, then this is a good way to do that. There may be other ways to make that association happen. Certainly, you could do the hard way where somebody has to email a client cert in and it gets associated. Hey, maybe you even have something watching that out-of-bound email and can do the associations automatically. But doing it directly in Gemini, just with the tools we have, this is a pretty cool way to do it. So for the update auth code piece, what we want to do is we want to create a key code. We want to set that key code in the database for later, and we want to show the user what it is. The rest of this is all old hat. So we look at the ID generator. That's the thing we have in the helper method here. Now this is not an optimized function for doing this. This is a simple way to generate a random 12-string character. I would not recommend you use this in production. If we look at if we look at what we're doing on the back end for this add cert, which we're going to get to in a second here, we're going to be looking up all of the different users by their key code rather than their user ID. And we're trying to fetch which user we're talking about, and then we're going to associate this new client cert with that user. But what that means is your key code needs to be unique amongst all your users. So if you were doing this in production, I would recommend first do something that has better entropy handling, that you're going to ensure a random number and not something that can be recreated. And also you probably want to salt this with something and probably even concatenate in the user ID, right? So even if somebody somehow randomly generated the same ID, unlikely but possible, and the salt thing aligned, then at least you have that ID concatenation in there, and it's unique to each user. So it's something. So consider yourself. This is one of those threat vectors for an app. If you're using this model, you're creating this string that could be used to add new access to an existing account. How do you secure that? Another thing you might want to do is maybe you have a backend service that's running on a timer that says, these keys, whatever you set here, they expire after 10 minutes. Whether maybe it's a service, maybe, when you create this field, there's also a date field that goes with it. This code was generated at X time, and it's only valid for the next 10 minutes. Whatever, kind of security you want to put on it, this is one of those places to harden, okay? So we create the key code, and the set add key code thing is just doing another simple database update with that, okay? Last but not least, what do we do with it? All right, we're getting the TLS client hash. We're getting that key code either from the query param or we're asking for it. And then we're going to add the cert to the user. So we have the key code and we have the TLS client hash. Add cert to user. Well, let's see here. Add cert to user is right here. We're going to first get the user ID by their key code. This is what I was saying. We have to search for that unique key code to get the user ID. And then finally, we add the hash to that user ID. So they're all associated. And that's it. Now, when I did this, in our example earlier, I created a new user. That first time I logged in, I created a user ID 17. And then when I associated it, it ended up becoming part of user ID 1. This is one of those situations where, you can make yours a little more robust. You don't need to generate a new account the first time you see a key. You could ask instead, were you trying to associate with a new one? If so, let's do the key code association. In my case, I now have a dead-ish or an unassociated user ID 17 in my database that's not tied to any keys anymore. I moved them, right? So there's no association there at all. It's just taking up space. I could write something to clean that up on a cron, or I could avoid creating it in the first place with a little bit more organization to this app. But that's it. That is how you create a CGI application in GemSpace on a shared host, right? Now, GemServe, I believe, is what Ben is using until they team. It enables CGI for all users and not within a certain CGI bin folder. Your CGI server might be different. It might require you to work within a certain folder. You might not have CGI enabled. That's basically your big limiting factors here on making something robust on your own. If you're not self-hosting, check with your admin about what server you're running. Make sure you look up the documentation for that particular server so you know what your environment variables are, if they're different than the ones I've got in the example here, and if you need to be working within a certain folder. This is all done in CGI using Python, but you see it was just a hashbang line at the start of the file. You could have done this in Bash. You could do this in C. It's up to you. There's really not a lot of limits once you get going. And certainly you can use a more robust database structure and kind of build up from there. But I hope this is a really good start for you and you have an idea of where you want to go with your own applications. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, set up a capsule entry on your own, post something to Gemini and comment. Try not to bash my Python too much. Like I said, it's not my thing. But certainly, if you have some advice to other people as well or some thoughts, please share them. All right. Take care, everybody.